When you hear the word empire, what comes to mind? Great armies, conquered cities, vast territories painted in a single color on a map. But in the 20th century, a very different kind of empire emerged. It didn't need soldiers. All it required were signatures, men in suits, and credit agreements tucked inside briefcases. The place where this hidden empire became most visible was Latin America. The International Monetary Fund didn't just lend money there. It rewrote entire economic systems, dictated national policies, and altered the fate of hundreds of millions of people, all in the name of stability. In reality, it was always in the interest of creditors. The paradox is striking. The IMF was founded in 1944 at Bretton Woods. Its mission was to stabilize exchange rates, prevent economic collapses, and help rebuild countries after the war. It sounds noble, doesn't it? Almost like a doctor of the financial world, arriving to heal. But in Latin America, that doctor quickly turned into a debt collector, unconcerned with the patient's condition, focused instead on making sure banks in New York and London got their money back. To understand how the IMF became so powerful, we need to go back to the mid-20th century and to Latin America. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina were racing to modernize. They built industries behind tariff walls, expanded state-owned companies, and subsidized food and fuel to keep their populations calm. Politicians promised growth today and postponed the bill for tomorrow. But tomorrow's bill would be enormous. In the 1970s, the world was flooded with cheap money. Oil prices soared, petrodollars piled up in Western banks, and those banks were desperate to lend. Latin American leaders saw an opportunity. Borrow in dollars, spend on infrastructure, finance social programs, and keep the political machine running. Roads, dams, factories, railways, all built with foreign money. For a while, it looked like a miracle. Growth was strong. Politicians were popular. But there was always an however. That however arrived in the early 1980s. To fight inflation, U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to extreme levels. Overnight, Latin America's cheap loans turned into crushing debt. What once carried 5% interest now demanded 15 to 20%. Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina suddenly couldn't pay. In 1982, Mexico's finance minister went to Washington and announced to the world, "We cannot service our debt." It was effectively a declaration of financial bankruptcy. And the IMF was there. But the IMF's helping hand came with conditions. Conditions so harsh they reshaped entire societies. Governments were required to cut food and fuel subsidies, devalue their currencies, making imports more expensive, freeze wages, privatize industries, and slash spending on healthcare, education, and pensions. In exchange for new loans, national budgets were no longer written in the parliaments of Mexico City or Buenos Aires, but in offices in Washington. And those budgets had one priority: make sure foreign banks got paid. For politicians, the IMF became the perfect shield. They told their people, "Our hands are tied. We have no choice," shifting all the pain onto the public while escaping responsibility themselves. Bread prices rose, public workers lost their jobs, schools lost funding, but foreign creditors were protected. Latin America became a laboratory for austerity. And the test subjects were the people. The results were devastating. Between 1980 and 1990, per capita income in Latin America fell. Countries grew poorer while sending billions of dollars abroad in debt payments. Economists called it the lost decade. Growth stalled, inequality deepened, poverty exploded, and the debt was still there. It was like forcibly taking the wallet of a man who was already drowning. Beyond the numbers was real life. In Caracas, riots erupted when fuel subsidies were cut. In Buenos Aires, wages were frozen while prices soared, triggering protests, hunger, unemployment, and political instability. In some countries, regimes collapsed. In others, dictators used IMF-backed austerity to justify harsher repression. The IMF always presented itself as neutral, technical, rational. But the truth was obvious. It was not neutral. It existed to protect the system and the creditors. Mexico was the first domino in 1982. During the 1970s oil boom, It had borrowed aggressively, assuming oil prices would stay high forever. When prices collapsed and interest rates surged, there was nowhere to hide. The announcement shook Wall Street. And Mexico wasn't alone. Dozens of countries had borrowed under the same logic. Banks were on the brink of collapse. That's when the IMF stepped in, not to save Latin America, but to save the global banking system. The deal was simple: new loans in exchange for spending cuts, privatization, and economic liberalization. Thus was born the famous Washington Consensus: trade liberalization, fiscal discipline, deregulation, and the sale of state-owned enterprises. In theory, economies would become efficient and competitive. In practice, social safety nets were torn apart and public assets were transferred to private, often foreign, investors. Bolivia became a textbook example. In 1985, it experienced one of the worst hyperinflations in history, with prices rising by thousands of percent in a single year. The IMF and local technocrats applied shock therapy: overnight subsidy cuts, currency devaluation, and brutal spending reductions. Inflation fell, yes, but the social cost was catastrophic. Unemployment soared, mines closed, villages emptied. On paper, stability arrived. For ordinary Bolivians, hunger and despair arrived instead. IMF officials praised it as a success. Bolivians remember it as a social disaster. Argentina shows how the medicine turned into poison. Throughout the 1990s, it followed IMF prescriptions to the letter, pegging the peso to the dollar, privatizing industries, cutting deficits. For a while, it was praised as a model student, attracting foreign capital. But underneath, debt was building, exports were losing competitiveness, and social tensions were rising. In 2001, everything collapsed. Banks froze accounts, people lost their savings overnight, and Buenos Aires exploded in protest. Crowds filled the streets chanting, "Que se vayan todos." They all must go. The IMF, once hailed as a savior, left with its credibility in ruins. The same story repeated across the region. In Brazil, IMF programs in the 1980s and 1990s curbed inflation but left behind deep inequality. In Peru, protections for workers and the poor were dismantled. The pattern was always the same: stability for creditors, stagnation for citizens. Why did politicians play along? Because the IMF was a perfect excuse. Borrow, spend, and stay popular in the short term. When crisis hits, call the IMF and let it prescribe the pain. When wages are cut and subsidies disappear, leaders shrug and say, "The IMF demands it." The 1980s truly were a lost decade. Average incomes fell, poverty surged, investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure collapsed. The region sent hundreds of billions of dollars abroad. At a time when it should have been catching up with the developed world, it fell further behind. Generations were trapped in cycles of poverty, while Wall Street banks were rescued. The power dynamic is crucial. The IMF portrayed itself as neutral economists, but its decisions were deeply political. The US and Europe dominated its board, the very places where creditor banks were based. The mission was clear: protect the system, even if people had to be sacrificed. Sovereignty wasn't eroded by tanks, but by spreadsheets. The most disturbing part is this: Latin America wasn't just a crisis zone, it was a laboratory. Austerity, privatization, and structural adjustment were tested there, then exported to the rest of the world. The 1997 Asian crisis, Russia in the 1990s, Greece after 2008, the same recipe, again and again. This leads to an uncomfortable question. Was Latin America's suffering simply the result of bad economic management? Or was it the cost of a global financial system designed to protect wealthy creditors? This history still matters, because it isn't just history, it's a warning. Today, the so-called developed world carries the same ingredients. Greece after 2008 followed the exact same script. The Troika, EU, ECB, IMF, arrived. Loans were granted, pensions were cut, public wages reduced, assets privatized. In Athens too, leaders said, "We have no choice." The result was familiar: hardship for the people, safety for creditors. Italy, Japan, even the United States, Today's debt levels would have terrified 1970s Latin America. The difference is that investors still believe these countries can pay. But that belief can vanish overnight. If interest rates stay high and growth falters, an IMF-style adjustment becomes inevitable. Debt is not just a number. It is a tool of control. In Latin America, leaders used debt for short-term politics. The IMF used that debt as leverage to dictate what countries could and could not do. Now, developed nations are accumulating the highest debts in history. The same trap is closing. It may not be called austerity. It might be sold as fiscal responsibility or market discipline. But the essence is the same. Budgets are rewritten to protect creditors, and the bill is sent to citizens. That's why we must never forget Latin America's lost decade. It showed how the system works, how money and power flow upward. Latin America was deemed expendable. Policies were tested without regard for human cost. The consequences were real. Decades of slow growth, rising inequality, and stolen opportunities. But the story can still take a different turn. If you see the pattern, you don't have to be the victim. Ordinary people may not be able to change IMF policies, but they can change how they think about debt, savings, and wealth. Your parents trusted banks. Banks collapsed. They believed housing prices would always rise. Then the crisis came. Now you're told to rely on speculative markets for retirement. Latin America's lesson is harsh, but liberating. Real wealth is not what systems you don't control promise you. It's assets that can't be devalued, skills that can't be confiscated, and relationships that can't be privatized. History repeats itself. The IMF's shadow over Latin America wasn't just a debt story. It showed what happens when numbers matter more than people. If we fail to learn that lesson, the same script will play again, not in Mexico City or Buenos Aires, but in the heart of Europe, in Tokyo, even in Washington. The next time a politician says, "We've been living beyond our means," or "We must make tough decisions," remember who pays the price. Remember Latin America's lost decade. Debt is never just debt. It is leverage. And there is always a hand on the other end of the lever. If this story gave you a new perspective, subscribe and leave a comment. History already contains the answers. I'm just showing you where to look.